All right, moving to the next section. Now we're going to get into what we call experiments. We have two ways that we can collect data. We can either use what's called an observational study, or we can look at an experiment. Now, an observational study, all we're doing is observing. Okay, we're seeing what's going on. These a lot of times are your surveys and things like that. We do nothing. Okay, give them a pretest, things like that. So you've given them no information. They're just filling out something. Okay, maybe it's a pretest. Again, like I said. Now, with an experiment, what it is, just like in science, you're doing something. We call it a treatment. Okay, there's some treatment being done. Okay, so a lot of times you'll deal with it in terms of medicine. Okay, where we'll test a new drug. Okay, so that drug will be your treatment. Okay, I could even look at it as a post-test. Okay, I'm giving you all this information through the chapter. That's the treatment. Now, how well do you remember it and understand it? All right, so a couple things that can come up though when we're designing experiments is one's called a lurking variable. Okay, it's not your explanatory response situation. Okay, when we talk about explanatory response, and we'll get to that more in a little bit, but the explanatory is maybe that medication. We think that it does something. Okay, so for instance, high cholesterol. We think a medication will reduce your cholesterol level. Okay, the response is the how did your cholesterol level change? The explanatory is the medication. Now, it might be another variable that also influenced what happened. Okay, so for instance, maybe a situation is you do well in high school. Okay, means that you're going to do well in college. Okay, there probably is a little bit about that. Okay, but there's also that lurking variable of motivation. Okay, you're motivated to do well in high school. You're motivated to do well in college. So it's another variable that we have to make sure we think about when we're setting up our experiment. Okay, confounding. Okay, or sometimes I'll talk about as confusing. Okay, that's a situation when we're not sure which variable is affecting your response. Okay, so is it that I did well in college that's affecting, or did well in high school that's affecting that I'm doing well in college, or is it because I'm motivated that's causing me to do well in college? So, they're very similar. Okay, but in both cases, you have to think about these things when you're setting up an experiment. Now, our most common type of experiment is what we call a completely randomized design. Okay, and so a lot of times we can set it up using this type of a diagram. And so we start out with our subjects, okay, our individuals, how many we ever have. And one of the key things that we want to talk about is then we want to randomly assign them to my different groups. Okay, so I could have more than two groups. I could have a group 3, I could have a group 4. It just depends on how many treatments we have and whatnot. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to randomly assign people to group number 1. And I need to know how many of them there are. And then the rest of them can go into group number 2. Okay, so we would like to have them equally balanced, but it doesn't always happen. Okay, then that first group will get treatment number 1. A second group will get treatment number 2. Now, sometimes this is a placebo, which we'll get to again in a second. Okay, but it's something for us to compare the treatment to. Okay, so if I'm going to take and test a new medication, maybe I test a new medication versus the old medication. Those are my two groups. Okay, or we talk about the placebo. Maybe it's a new medication and then it's a sugar pill. Okay, it looks like the other one. Then we come back and compare our results. Okay, how did they go? Okay, now here's my explanatory variable. Okay, here's my response variable. Okay, so if we're setting it up. Now, one thing we also have to do, occasionally is if we're going to compare something once in a while, like say cholesterol level, we may have to measure the cholesterol level before we start. And then we come back and measure again. and then compare that difference would be our response. Okay. So getting into our 3 principles of experimental design, okay, and we saw them in the last one. We had to start out again with that idea of a randomization, okay. We're going to get into the idea of the SRS again, the simple random sample, okay. Then we went along and we talked about having that thing to compare it to. That's your control, okay. So your control once in a while could be that placebo, okay. But what it is, we need something to compare. And occasionally you hear this called a comparative experiment as well. Third thing we need is replication. Okay? We need enough subjects. Okay? I can't do an experiment with 5 people in each group and trust the results. So we need a large number of subjects, or we could also replicate the experiment and do it over again, okay, multiple times. But these 3 things always should be looked at when I'm setting up any type of an experiment. Okay. Experiments sometimes can be blind, sometimes can be double blind. Okay. With that completely randomized, we want that to be blind. We want so the subjects don't know which treatment they're getting. Okay. In some experiments, if we know that we're getting treatment, okay, we might do things differently. So suppose it's like a dentist testing a new toothpaste. Okay, it's supposed to reduce cavities. Well, I might change my brushing habits just because I know I'm part of this experiment. Double blind, subjects don't know, and the people evaluating don't know. Okay, it is possible that if I know that you're getting the treatment, and if it's an evaluation and I can ask you certain questions, or I can be biased in terms of what I think the results will look like. So that's why sometimes we want to know it's double blind. Somewhere along the line somebody has track of who got what, but when I do my evaluating I don't know which treatment you took. Alright, 2 other types of experiments that we can have is one's called the matched pairs. Okay, and I always talk about matched pairs as Coke versus Pepsi. Okay. 2 treatments to each individual. Okay. 2 treatments to each individual. Each person will drink the Coke and then the Pepsi, and then they'll make their choice. Now, our randomization here okay. Half need to do the Coke, then the Pepsi, and then half need to do the Pepsi, then the Coke. And that's how we randomize our matched pairs. Third type is a block design. Okay, now do not mix this up with a stratified random sample. Okay, stratified random sample is how we collect our data. Block is an experiment, but what we do is we believe that the explanatory variable may have an effect on different subjects. Different effect on different subjects. Okay, a lot of times we can talk about male and female. So what would happen is when we set up our design, what we do is we start with our subjects, and then we break them into our blocks, and then from there, it's a random assignment, break it into your groups, come back, compare. Randomly assign your females, break them into your groups, come back, compare. Okay. We're not going to come back at the end and put them all into one group. We're going to see the results for the males, see the results for the females, okay, and see if one of them had a better effect on the other than the other. All right, so that's section 2.